Hi, and welcome to a Friday ghostly reading. This is part of the Ghosts of Christmas Past event. I'm reading from Vampires, Zombies, Werewolves, and Ghosts, 25 Classic Stories of the Supernatural. I found this at my library, many amazing authors, and turns out I'd actually read a Charles Dickens before I read The Signalman, which is the story that we're reading as a group event. The other Charles Dickens that I read, The Lawyer and the Ghost. This is on page 61. It's also a lovely collection as each story starts with a little bit of information about the author. They have Charles Dickens, 1812 to 1870. And it talks a bit about his life and different works that he had written. The Lawyer and the Ghost is from 1836. I knew a man, let me see, 40 years ago now, who took an old, damp, rotten set of chambers in one of the most ancient inns that had been shut up and empty for years and years before. There were lots of old women's stories about the place, and it certainly was very far from being a cheerful one. But he was poor and the rooms were cheap, and that would have been quite a sufficient reason for him if they'd been 10 times worse than they really were. The man was obliged to take some mouldering fixtures that were on the place, and among the rest was a great lumbering wooden press for papers with large glass doors and a green curtain inside, a pretty useless thing for him, for he had no papers to put in it, and as to his clothes, he carried them about with him, and that wasn't very hard work either. Well, he'd moved in all his furniture, it wasn't quite a truckful, and had sprinkled it about the room so as to make the 4 chairs look as much like a dozen as possible, and was sitting down before the fire at night, drinking the first glass of 2 gallons of whiskey he'd ordered on credit, wondering whether it would ever be paid for, and if so, in how many years' time, when his eyes encountered the glass doors of the wooden press. "Ah," says he, "if I hadn't been obliged to take that ugly article at the old broker's valuation, I might have got something comfortable for the money. I'll tell you what it is, old fellow," he said, speaking aloud to the press, having nothing else to speak to. "If it wouldn't cost more to break up your old car case than it would ever be worth afterwards, I'd have a fire out of you in less than no time." He'd hardly spoken the words when a sound resembling a faint groan appeared to issue from the interior of the case. It startled him at first, but thinking on a moment's reflection that it must be some young fellow in the next chamber who has been dining out, he put his feet on the fender and raised the poker to stir the fire. At that moment the sound was repeated, and one of the glass doors, slowly opening, disclosed a pale and emaciated figure in solid and worn apparel standing erect in the press. The figure was tall and thin, and the countenance expressive of care and anxiety, but there was something in the hue of the skin and gaunt and unearthly appearance of the whole form which no being of this world was ever seen to wear. "Who are you?" said the new tenant, turning very pale, poising the poker in his hand, however, and taking a very decent aim at the countenance of the figure. "Who are you?" "Don't throw that poker at me," replied the form. "If you hurled it with ever so sure an aim, it would pass through me without resistance and expend its force on the wood behind. I am a spirit." "And pray, what do you want here?" faltered the tenant. "In this room," replied the apparition, "my worldly ruin was worked, and I and my children beggared. In this press the papers in a long, long suit, which accumulated for years, were deposited. In this room, when I had died of grief and long-deferred hope, two wily harpies divided the wealth for which I had contested during a wretched existence, and of which at last not one farthing was left for my unhappy descendants. I terrified them from the spot, and since that day have prowled by night, the only period at which I can revisit the earth, about the scenes of my long protracted misery. This apartment is mine. Leave it to me. If you insist upon making your appearance here, said the tenant, who had had time to collect his presence of mind during this prosy statement of the ghost, I shall give up possession with the greatest pleasure. But I should like to ask you one question, if you will allow me. Say on, said the apparition sternly. Well, said the tenant, I don't apply the observation personally to you, because it's equally applicable to most of the ghosts I've ever heard of. But it does appear to me somewhat inconsistent that when you've an opportunity of visiting the fairest spots of earth, for I suppose space is nothing to you, you should always return exactly to the very places where you've been most miserable. Egad, that's very true. I never thought of that before, said the ghost. You see, sir, pursued the tenant, this is a very uncomfortable room. From the appearance of that press, I should be disposed to say that it's not wholly free from bugs, and I really think you might find more comfortable quarters, to say nothing of the climate of London, which is extremely disagreeable. You're very right, sir, said the ghost politely. It never struck me till now. I'll try a change of air directly. In fact, he began to vanish as he spoke. His legs, indeed, had quite disappeared. And if, sir, said the tenant, calling after him, if you would have the goodness to suggest to the other ladies and gentlemen who are now engaged in haunting old empty houses that they might be much more comfortable elsewhere, you will confer a very great benefit on society. I will, replied the ghost. We must be dull fellows, very dull fellows indeed. I can't imagine how we can have been so stupid. With these words the spirit disappeared, and what is rather remarkable, he never came back again. So if you've ever watched any paranormal videos, and the big question is, why do ghosts go back to their old haunts where tragedy and bad things have happened? I guess now, thanks to Charles Dickens, we know the answer. No one's ever told them they could go somewhere else. I hope you've enjoyed this reading. I wish you all the best for the holiday season. And until next time, take good care.